Welcome to episode 11. This is the Beyond Crude podcast, a podcast dedicated to discussing fossil fuel and particularly the East African crude oil pipeline. A 5 billion, now we are told slightly higher, project that will run from Hoima all the way to Tanga. It's going to be the longest heated pipeline at 1,443 kilometers. In our last episode, the last two episodes have been about litigation, and they've been inspired by what's happening to the KCB 11. These are the 11 Ugandan activists that have been in jail for opposing EACOP. So the last time when they were arrested on the 23rd of April, they were planning to share a letter with the bank authorities to explain their position on why they'd rather KCB Bank Uganda pull out of EACOP. Instead, they got arrested and have been in jail up until last week, Wednesday, that is the 22nd of July, having spent 3 months in jail. This KCB 11 case is a reminder to us that the fight that we are in, this struggle is not just theoretical, it's not hypothetical. People are getting harmed, people are being punished. These 11 activists had been severed from their families. One lady actually lost a job in the period that she was in jail and couldn't even be able to reach out to her children, 6 of them, for the period that she was in jail. So once again, it's a reminder of how crude the fossil fuel industry is and how it fights back unjustly. And the last 2 episodes, as we focused on litigation issues, including climate litigation, we kept asking ourselves, whose justice system is this? Who does it serve? And that explained why we were delving into litigation issues. So here's what I want us to remember. Mark your calendars, because the next hearing of the KCB 11 is coming up on August 26th. This case isn't over yet. The pressure must stay on. And now this brings us to today's episode. And if you thought last week was the last few episodes were about the legal front, today we follow the money. And my guests today are Antoine and Zaki. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. Let's start with you, Antoine.
Hi, I'm Antoine Bouet. I work for Reclaim Finance. It's an organization based in France. And I'm the coordinator of a global campaign supported by several organizations across the world that is called Defund TotalEnergies. The objective is to get finance, so banks, investors, insurance, to stop supporting the company known as Total or TotalEnergies because of its oil and gas projects across the world, including in Uganda and Tanzania. And I take the opportunity to join you and Zaki, of course, to celebrate the release and above all the courage and determination of the 11 young people who were arrested and detained for simply calling for justice in their country. Thanks.
Thank you, Antoine. Zaki?
Many thanks, Comrade Abud, Comrade Antoine. It's a pleasure to be here. And thanks to all the listeners, the comrades, the friends, the partners, the allies, and the ordinary people who are engaging with this podcast and with these critical issues that really mark our time. My name is Zaki Mamdou. I'm based in Johannesburg in South Africa, but I am the coordinator of the Stop EACOP campaign and coalition. Yes, like Comrade Antoine said, myself as well, also celebrating the release of the KCB 11, but really reminding us of their courage, their sacrifice, and the immense, inspiration that they are to all of us in putting themselves forward to confront such a harmful project and put themselves on the line in order to ensure that it is indeed stopped.
Awesome, Zaki. Anton, we're going to start with you. So a couple of weeks now, I think towards the end of June, we had news that TotalEnergies had secured 3 billion euros from about 7 banks to through bond purchases. Could you walk us through this? What does that mean? And also, the fear we really have with that news is that it then therefore means that Total could very easily fund the EACOP project by itself without necessarily depending on, the equity debt ratio issue.
Sure. Yes, I'm going to try to explain what bonds are, and of course why they are important to the fight against the EACOP project. So basically, when a company like Total wants to raise money, they have several choices, but mainly they go to three main choices. One, they can decide to sell shares to investors. And so the investors take a percentage of the ownership of the company, so Total, by buying the shares. The second way, which is one that has been the subject of strong mobilizations across the globe regarding the EACOP project, is that the Total can try to access loans either for specific projects, such as the EACOP project or other projects in Mozambique, in Namibia, in South Africa, for example, or loans for their corporate financing. And finally, they can decide, Total can decide to sell bonds to investors. So what is a bond? A bond, it's a bit like a loan. It's a large loan, but it's cut into small pieces and it's sold to investors on financial markets. So with a bond, the investors that buy the bonds, they will lend money to the company for a period of time. It can be 5 years, it can be 10 years, it can go up to 40 years sometimes. And Total will pay back the full amount of that money at the end of that period. So after 5, 10, 15 years. In the meantime, at regular moments, so for example, every year, Total will only pay regular interest payments, so smaller amounts. So that's how it works. And to issue such a bond, to sell such a bond, the company, Total, needs a deal maker. Only a bank can play that role. For large bonds, such as the ones that Total is using, the one you mentioned, 3 billion euros that were sold on July 1st this year, Total will need several deal makers, several banks that will help it sell its bond on financial markets. So why are we talking about bonds today? Because they are a huge chunk of the new oil and gas fundraising that companies are accessing, especially for companies such as Total. Total has become very toxic thanks to civil society mobilizations, to banks. And so banks are now very reluctant to give them loans. That's what we are seeing with the EACOP project, right? So Total has had to turn to bonds. Over the past 10 years, bonds have represented 75% of TotalEnergies financing. So it's huge. And over the past 2 years, Total has raised $16.3 billion through bonds. So that's one of the reasons. The other reason is that basically bonds have no strings attached. Total can use it for any project. That means that, in a nutshell, when Total raises 3 billion euros on July 1st this year through bonds on financial markets, it can use it for any of its projects, for the EACOP project in Uganda and Tanzania, for the Mozambique LNG project, or other projects in Namibia, in South Africa, as well as in Suriname, in Latin America, or Papua New Guinea in the Pacific Ocean.
So does this, from what you're explaining, it seems like Total has gotten a really good deal compared to, having to rely on banks. And do you know, and can you name the number of banks that have offered Total or have purchased these bonds or have offered Total these 3 billion in bonds?
Yes, these bonds are from across the globe. So you have a Spanish bank, BBVA. You have a German bank, Deutsche Bank. You have JP Morgan in the US. You have MUFG in Japan, Royal Bank of Canada. Société Générale in France, and Wells Fargo as well in the US. So you really see that Total has gotten support from banks across the world for that bond.
This is surprising because some of those banks that you've mentioned had publicly said that they were not planning to fund EACOP, for instance. So I wanted to move to Zaki before I come back to you. Zaki, you've spent a lot of time organizing with communities, even as the coordinator of the Stop EACOP campaign, getting them to amplify their voices on global stage about their opposition. I wonder how you're interpreting this news.
Sure. So, look, I mean, it is concerning by all means, and not just for us in the kind of solidarity spaces and who are organizing around this issue at many different levels, but certainly concerning as well communities on the front lines who are confronted by the onslaught of EACOP and its associated projects. I think what is incredibly frustrating is, like you correctly pointed out, the decisions of banks like MUFG, who previously had made commitments under public scrutiny and as a result of public pressure, had made commitments not to back or bankroll the EACOP project, yet would still funnel resources and capital into Total and enable it to continue to roll out its destructive operations across the continent through buying up its bonds and whatever else. But I'd say that, look, while that frustration is there and that concern is there, hopelessness is certainly not an option, and especially for communities on the front lines of the sites of struggle. Because when you are hopeless, the only other choice and option available to you is to give up entirely. And now for communities on the front lines who are reeling from the impacts of livelihood loss, of dispossession, of land loss, the impacts of the social unraveling in their communities and the unraveling of their local economies. Hopelessness is not an option, because giving up is not an option, because these are questions which are a matter of life or death. The daily bread and butter issues, whether you will put enough food on the table at the end of the day, whether you will have a roof over your head, whether your children will go to school. These are questions of life and death. And so while it is concerning, it is also absolutely the case that communities are fighting back and have been fighting back consistently. And in this current moment, there is a new wave and a new surge of activity within impacted communities, organizing themselves and organizing with each other, to put forward a serious contestation to EACOP and its associated projects. And I think, that's in many ways it's a given, because all resistance that you could ever study and see and witness and be a part of across any society and throughout history, all resistance is born of oppression. People don't simply come out and resist because they feel like it or they have nothing to do, but people resist because they are threatened, and because they are oppressed or are living under oppressive conditions. And so even if it were the case that Total decides to take all this money and funnel it into EACOP and rapidly develop the project and build it tomorrow and start, exporting crude in the way in which it wants to, the resistance would not be shattered. It would not die down then, because the struggle continues, because the project in itself will continue and does continue to threaten people's lives.
Thanks, Zach. It's good to know that the community's hopes will not be dashed, or that their hopes are not dampened by this news. But I would want to come back to you, Antoine. Same question, but differently. So what do you think, for instance, now that we know that a couple of banks that had publicly told the public that they were no longer interested in funding EACOP, citing their climate commitments and ESGs, and they're now supporting TotalEnergies through these bonds that you say Total can very much easily use for any project because they're not tied to anything. What do you think that tells us about those banks? Do you think they take their commitments seriously? What does that tell you in general?
Well, first, as Saki mentioned, it's first of all a recognition of the impact of the campaigns that have been going on for years against the EACOP project, targeting those banks, targeting insurances, and the impact against all other projects of Total in many parts of Africa and many parts of the world. The banks are reluctant to provide, very reluctant to provide loans to Total, and so that's why Total has to go to that easier way of accessing money for them, but also a way by which banks can try to say that they don't have a responsibility in the climate crisis and the project. Because indeed, the banks, they will tell you that, as you mentioned, the bond is not directly attached to a specific fuel project, a fossil fuel project, or to fossil fuels in general. That's overall true, but for a company like Total, which in 2024 produced 96% of its energy through oil and gas, there's obviously a huge chance that the money that they provide and that they help Total raise on the financial market will be used for oil and gas projects. So regarding the commitments that they make when they say, for example, that they won't finance the EACOP project, or that they won't finance any oil and gas project, or that they have a decarbonization target, most of the time, the bank will leave the small door open to support Total in issuing bonds. What's important in there is that there are already a few banks at international level that have excluded supporting Total and other oil and gas companies through bonds. This has only happened recently, and once again, it happened because of years of pressure from civil society. So I can briefly cite two banks in France. BNP Paribas. BNP Paribas is one of the top 10 largest banks in the world. And after facing litigation, mobilization by civil society, public pressure, and public scrutiny, they have announced last year in 2024 that they will not provide any support through bonds to companies such as Total, so to oil and gas companies. And there are a few other ones, such as Crédit Agricole, as well in France, that from public pressure has decided not to provide any funding through bonds to TotalEnergies and the like of it. So basically what this tells us and what it tells our movement is that the work we're doing, the mobilization we're participating in, are working. And so we need to continue with those mobilizations.
Oh, that's a very interesting point you've made, that indeed there are banks that are also now just not letting fossil fuel giants like Total have a backdoor in the form of bonds. I think that's a good point to come to you, Zaki, because now that we are seeing that the pressure that people like Antoine have been applying, and of course campaigns like the Stop EACOP campaign that have led to such banks making such key decisions, something else has been happening in the background, that there's been a lot of different communities across the continent that are now targeting individual fossil fuel companies that they want out of the continent because of some of the harm that has happened. And I hear it's called Kick Total Out of Africa. I would like you to speak more about that. What does that mean? Where is it coming from? And why has it come to this point?
Sure. So before I get to that point, maybe just to also contribute a bit and build on what Comrade Antoine has shared, if I may. I think it's also important that we understand that banks and bankers, but also investor cartels and others, they use things like bonds very much as a smokescreen, which is why, while it's very concerning, the way in which Total's bonds are being issued and bought up, and it's able to access additional capital as a result of the thing, it also shouldn't take us by surprise, if we must be completely honest. And the reality is that, as Comrade Anton pointed out, direct financing of these sorts of projects is under too much public scrutiny at the moment. And of course, banks and the bankers and investor cartels and others are interested in protecting their reputation. They're interested in continuing to give themselves political cover and legitimacy. While at the end of the day, they are as interested in profits as companies like Total and any of the industrial capitalists who are directly driving these destructive projects. In fact, it is the unholy alliance that exists between the finance capitalists and the industrial capitalists that is the bedrock and the basis of imperialism itself. It's what enables the export of oppression into the broader global south, as it were. And it's why we see these mega destructive, extractive projects which displace our communities and destroy them and destroy our natural world, our environments, and our prospects of economic sovereignty, our prospects of diverse local economies that are set up to meet people's needs and all of these things. It's that alliance, that marriage between the two that enables that to begin with. And so it's not just through bonds, but it's also through things like ESG financing, where there too, a lot of the money that Total would receive through those sorts of things comes through in the form of general corporate financing. And what that then does is allows them to shift their capital around for additional equity into projects where they're not getting the right amount of debt financing from banks or whatever else. And so the point that I'm trying to make simply before I get to your actual question, Onyach, is that bankers are not neutral in all of this. They're not simply there, to provide some sort of unbiased and objective view around development or whatever else, but they very much and in very real terms have mutual interests with extractive industry. And you'd see it in the ways in which bankers sit on the boards of extractive industry and companies like Total. You see it in the ways in which there'd be massive investments that are sitting and generating profit. And so their own profits and the lining of their own pockets very much relies as well on the continued extraction and exploitation of and destruction of our communities, exploitation of our people, and the destruction of our environment and our ecosystems as well. And so against that backdrop, where we are seeing, and this is to get to your question, Onyach, where we are seeing a further radicalization of social movements on the African continent around a number of different things. Things, of course, like debt cancellation, things like nationalization, not only of productive industry, but also of, the financial industry itself. And I know even in campaign work around Standard Bank in South Africa, there's a rising tide within sections of the climate movement that while Standard Bank, because of its involvement in the Cabo Delgado gas projects, because of its involvement in EACOP, because of its involvement in bankrolling destructive coal projects and stuff like that in South Africa, that it must be nationalized as well. So that kind of radicalization has also taken place in the movement that is confronting TotalEnergies. And so there has been a network set up under the banner of Kick Total out of Africa. And that network is organizing toward a Africa Week of Action, which will be held from the 18th of August until the 24th of August. And basically, community civic organizations, NGOs, faith-based networks, artists, unions, social movements, communities, and just activists across the continent are coming together for something of a continental uprising during that week of action to demand that TotalEnergies pay up and get out, and are using that opportunity to self-organize and to take action and to support various initiatives that are being planned in different countries around the continent, including in Uganda, in Tanzania, in Kenya, in Senegal, in Benin, in Togo, in Nigeria, in South Africa. really to put forward, one, the testimony and the aspirations of impacted communities across the continent who are recognizing their shared experience of Total. You know, what communities are experiencing in Uganda is no different to what communities are experiencing in Tanzania and in Mozambique. What we are seeing happening with EACOP, the result of that is what we have seen happen in the Niger Delta, for example. So people are uniting around a shared set of demands for African governments to cancel all government contracts and licenses and partnerships with TotalEnergies, to hold Total accountable, and to ensure and demand that Total pay reparations for the harm and the displacement and the pollution that it has caused, but also demanding that community rights to defend their lands and to decide how their resources are used, are protected, uplifted, and advanced. And finally, demanding that a just transition from below, grounded in forms of social and public ownership of renewable energy systems, which are designed to benefit people and not serve the interests of profiteers, that those demands come to the fore during that week of action as well.
Thanks for that elaborate response, Zaki. Anton, Zaki is saying that we should have known that this is happening, but clearly a number of us were caught flat-footed about this. Where do we go from here? Can we still hold them accountable? And then here is the banks, because already we are seeing that this is a backdoor way of avoiding accountability. That on the one hand, they can say, we are very serious about climate impacts. We are very serious about what fossil fuel industry is doing, or rather the contribution of the fossil fuel industry in advancing the climate crisis. And so we will not fund any fossil fuels. But then also offer purchase these bonds. So it, in a sense, it's like they are, like Zaki is saying, this is what they are aligning with, but they are sidestepping accountability. So what I wonder from someone like you who's spent a lot of time looking at financial institutions and trying to pressure them into doing what's right, how do we pressure them? What's the weakest point, if at all? Is it the shareholders? Is it the customers? Is it the regulations that we need to tighten up? Where do we go from here?
Well, that's the $1 billion question, right? No, clearly, the most progressive allies that we have first are the customers, or at least as potential allies. Across the globe, you see citizens, you see the people recognizing, of course, the impacts of climate change, the harsh reality on communities of climate change, and understanding more and more the power that they have as citizens, as customers, to pressure the banks, the companies as well. And you see that they are more and more ready to act in support of social movements. So obviously, customers would be the first allies. Then you mentioned shareholders, regulators. Look, it's really a combination of all, and it depends on the context of each country. It's easy to say, but when you look at French banks, because I'm French, it has been a combination of all those elements that has brought the top two banks of Total, BNP Paribas and Crédit Agricole, to stop supporting the company through bonds. It has been pressure from all parts. Mobilizations by social movements have been targeting BNP Paribas, but also a litigation in court. So the company really got scared. It got scared also of its reputation, because the students were saying, we won't join you and we won't be your customers as long as you continue fueling the climate crisis. It has been also their peers. It has been the regulators, so the French and European authorities, asking for more transparency and holding them accountable. So it's really a combination of all those actors, and then it depends on the context of each country. And of course, I mean, today, in the current global context, we're seeing a lot of setbacks, but we're also seeing continuous wins, we are also seeing that Total keeps on having a hard time financing the EACOP project. So it's a struggle that we're fighting. It's a very long-term struggle, but we have to continue maintaining the pressure because that struggle is for, well, potentially the rest of our lives.
Thanks for that perspective, Anton. Actually, it's very easy to fall into the trap of being depressed and feeling defeated. And yet there have been the fact that you've mentioned that Total has struggled to fund EACOP is a testament of resilience. It's a testament that there's actually work being done and that the pressure is indeed working. And I like that you're saying that despite the context, that even PNB, the two banks, I'm forgetting, is it Panabis? I'm always confusing how to pronounce them. The French banks, the big French banks have been able to make these important decisions because of the public pressure and, of course, as you're saying, litigation. And I wanted to, on that note, ask you, Zaki, how do we as communities, as frontline communities, as Africans, and even as you're saying that you want to kick Total out of Africa, how does this happen when the same Total is also very, very good with PR? For instance, right now, I know the African, it's called the African, is it the Women African Football or the African Women Football Federation? Is now being sponsored by them. Remember earlier this year, the African Cup of Nations was also sponsored by them. And so, one, I don't know whether I could call this greenwashing, but what do you say to this and how do you counter these kind of things how do you kick Total out of Africa when already they have, presented themselves as the saviors, as the people who are doing everything good for the communities?
Look, I mean, it absolutely is greenwashing. And I think we must be clear on seeing it for what it is, because the reality is that Total's business model does not rest on we want people to play soccer or football or we want to fund schools or whatever else. There would be an entirely different kind of company if that was the core business model. All of these things that it does are simply, by the way, its core business model is rooted and inseparable from the project of extraction, right? And it's not, I mean, even now, of course, Total has its own greenwashing and PR stunts around its investments into renewable energy and things like that as well. But then too, that is not part of its core business model because its real profits are a result of dispossession, of exploitation, and of destruction in order to extract resources from the broader global south, but Africa in particular, so that they can line the pockets of a multinational elite and also serve the energy needs of countries abroad at the direct expense of the post-colonial world. So this is a company that is, by all means, colonial in its character, in its operation, in its function, in its very essence, as it were. And so, I think, the other point to mention is that companies like Total and Total in particular have also done very well in their propaganda mission and in giving themselves political cover and in giving themselves legitimacy in various ways. And they do it, through things like the most loved and most played sports on the African continent and sponsoring the biggest tournament thereof by way of AFCON and now the women's AFCON tournament. They do it by sponsoring bursaries at institutions of higher learning across the continent. We're seeing a huge uptick in MOUs being signed between Total and universities, where of course they are desperate because they know the impacts that EACOP will have. They know it, they are well aware of it, but they are desperate to buy themselves legitimacy through co-opting the narrative, controlling it, and finding ways that are very, marginal cost to them, considering the immense capital that they have, but find ways to make it appear as though they are interested in development or in progression in our communities and all of these things. And you'll see it by way of the propaganda tours that they do for investors in EACOP communities, for example, where they, completely gloss over any impacts, harm, concerns from communities, and will present the parts of it that make it seem as though that they're, doing things that benefit ordinary people while they don't. And so our role in the whole process is to be as consistent as possible. We have to recognize we're up against something that is huge, that is incredibly well resourced, and that has its fingers in every pot. But regardless of that, we are more than they are. And as we continue one step at a time, one mind at a time, one friend at a time, one comrade at a time, one organization at a time, as we continue to build organization with each other and to build consciousness around the realities over time, we can build the critical mass that is required for us to actually achieve revolutionary victories over companies like Total.
Thanks, Zaki. I was going to ask you to actually mention a couple of things that I know was part of the reason why this KTOA came about in terms of the issues with Cabo Delgado, the cases in South Africa. But before we go to that, I just wanted to mention for the sake of our audience that greenwashing is when a company pretends to be more environmentally friendly than it actually is. And so you can think of it as a form of misleading advertising or whitewash for a company's reputation. So instead of making real meaningful changes to their business practices to become more sustainable, they use clever marketing, vague language, or deceptive claims to make consumers believe they are green. And so this is why Zaki, for instance, is saying that they're engaging in green washing simply because of how they position themselves in the sponsorship of key things that Africans enjoy and like football. So Zaki, if you could briefly talk about some of the things, because we know for Total for communities to want to kick it out of Africa, it means that there are some very real extractive projects that have gone really sour. And I think what comes to mind right now is the Cabo Delgado gas plant in Mozambique. Just briefly, some of the things that have happened there, the cases in South Africa that you think are making all these communities come together like this.
Sure. So, I mean, look, I think across the continent, the experience of Total, wherever it has its operations, is that it leads to a great deal of destruction. And Total is actually it's not unique in that sense. The same can and should be applied to all of these major fossil fuel companies and multinational companies, including, of course, Shell and Eni and Exxon and BP, which are very much Total counted among them. And Total, of course, being one of the larger ones and one of the ones that is really active in Africa, which is why we have our sights on them currently. But all of these companies, where they plant themselves down in the interest of securing gas reserves or oil reserves, they do so to the absolute destruction of communities, but also of entire nations. And so what you find, is at the community level, is immediate displacement, right? So where they are building pipelines or where they are engaging in exploration or where they are actively drilling, there's immediately people who are immediately displaced, kicked off of their land, have their income generating streams disrupted, and whatever it may be, the result is that they can't make ends meet, and they can't put food on the table, they can't send kids to school, they can't access healthcare and all of these things. And through that process, and at the beginning of that process, in fact, the way in which companies like Total go about it, and the way in which Total has gone about it, is through coercion, co-option, and intimidation. And this has happened not just in Uganda and Tanzania, but it's happened in South Africa. It's happened in Mozambique, where people are threatened off of their land. They are threatened into signing really inadequate and performative compensation agreements, or signing things that they don't fully understand to begin with. So there's no free, prior, and informed consent. There's no, participatory planning, and whatever it may be. And of course, part of the bigger crisis that you then see is the national implications, because all of these projects that Total, which is a French, a giant French multinational company, all of these projects that it pursues are designed for export of raw materials and raw resources. So there's no value addition, there's no local manufacturing, there's no benefication of communities who can directly gain from the use of their own resources that belong to the people of this land. And instead, profits are shipped overseas. Countries who get involved in these projects are made to take huge loans, find themselves in deepening debt traps. We see that in Nigeria, for example, where Nigeria, and Angola as well, where both countries are huge exporters of oil, but have severe and crushing debt, which in turn, causes the collapse of public infrastructure, public services. Governments can't pay to subsidize school and healthcare and employment and all of these things. But a big part of the reason for that is because, these companies come in and they make grand promises of development, and of filling and lining state coffers with finances, to be able to develop. But in reality, and history shows us this every time in every African continent where this is the reality, that national elites fill their pockets, multinational elites fill their pockets, resources are used to the benefit of economies overseas, and the African people are left to shoulder the entirety of the social and the environmental costs.
Thanks, Zaki. Recently, the International Court of Justice made a landmark ruling that countries had an obligation to cut greenhouse gas emissions under both climate treaties and international law. Anton, I wanted your thoughts on this ICJ ruling. So it says that governments have legal duties to cut emissions. How does this change the game for holding banks accountable?
But I guess I would say it can be at two levels, right? First, of course, it's an immense tool for social movements in countries which can now hold their own governments accountable and call them off in national courts for not regulating the climate tracking investments of banks, of investors, of insurers. So indeed, it could be a new tool at national level. But above all, it can be also an opportunity for climate justice at global level. Now, governments from countries who have been suffering the most from climate change can call on other countries who have benefited from centuries of exploitation, of colonialism, and of emissions to be responsible for their fossil fuel emissions, their past, present, and future emissions, and call them to change their system, legal system, and economic system, so that they cut the emissions, but also that they contribute to cutting emissions at global level. So that as well, it could be used as a tool to get these governments from the global north to adopt new regulatory frameworks, for example, to force finance out of fossil fuels. So it needs to be taken up not only at national level in the north, but as well as by movements and by governments who have been the most hardly hit by climate change.
Thanks for that. Zaki, same question. I think already Antoine may have alluded to it, but as someone who's spent a lot of time organizing with communities, what do you think are low-hanging fruits that are coming out of this?
Sure. So, I mean, I think first it's important to recognize that any legal avenue available to us and available to social movements and to communities must be viewed as one weapon in a broader arsenal that then characterizes a campaign. But certainly, there are new legal and political opportunities here and space for communities who are fighting Total and fighting against EACOP. And of course, while the ruling is not directly binding on corporations, it does clarify and strengthen the legal obligations of states under international law, specifically those, to prevent environmental harm and towards climate change and whatever, and so forth and so on. And so there would be space for impacted communities in Uganda and Tanzania, for example, to argue that their governments are in violation of international law because they've approved and facilitated a fossil fuel project that would exacerbate climate change, despite the duty that they have to protect both current and future generations. They'd be able to argue that these states have failed to regulate or prevent corporate activities that are contributing significantly to climate harm, and argue that prioritizing fossil fuel profits over human rights and ecosystems and community well-being is and stands in direct contradiction of the ICJ's articulation of these climate obligations. So certainly, there's a lot of pressure that can be built there, including, of course, as Comrade Antoine had mentioned, pressure on international finance institutions. Specifically, movements and communities impacted by these projects can use this ruling to escalate international pressure, highlighting, of course, the well-documented impacts of projects like EACOP, of projects like the Mozambique LNG pursuit, but highlighting those impacts to make the point that any support for these projects may be complicit in state violations of international climate obligations. And of course, this works to then amplify the argument that climate and human rights due diligence standards must now reflect this evolving legal consensus. And so there's ways there in which financing for these projects can at least be, at least financing can be thwarted.
Awesome. Thank you both. Any last word? This has been an incredibly fascinating conversation. And I'm just noting that in as much as we started off noting that Total got 3 billion euros, we are concluding on a very interesting note that the ICJ ruling is also very empowering. Do you have any last words, Antoine, that you may want to share?
Well, discussing indeed those rulings and the litigation, it's what we're seeing and what we've seen in recent years is indeed states, companies, oil and gas companies being held more and more accountable. On finance, on the side of finance, there's indeed a new front to open to hold the financiers, the banks, the investors, and the insurers accountable as well in courts, and that is an avenue that has been opened in France, for example, targeting BNP Paribas, but that should also be followed on other cases by social movements, so that indeed they are forced by law and by courts to recognize their responsibility and to change their behavior. So it's a very promising ruling for globally the movements.
Indeed. What about you, Zaki? Any last words?
Sure. So I suppose mine would just be an appeal, if anything, just to say that accountability doesn't come from nowhere, and there's no world in which we can ever expect those who are responsible for a crisis and those who directly benefit from our demise to regulate themselves. There's no world in which they will hold themselves accountable. I mean, even this ICJ case was spearheaded and brought by young people from the Pacific Islands, who brought this to the global stage. And of course, there's caveats and there's shortfalls, especially in terms of enforceability and all of these things. But certainly it's an important symbolic victory. But regardless, and can open up real material avenues for accountability. But regardless, what it means and what it demonstrates is that ordinary people need to get involved. As many people as possible, wherever you are, whoever you are, wherever you are listening to this from. This moment, this historical moment that we are living through and a part of, is one that we cannot simply stand to let pass us by. And we have to assert ourselves as active participants in history and not as passive bystanders, because it is only through our involvement, it is only through our organizing together and our initiative, our creativity, our courage, and our conviction that we will be able to prevent the worst implications of the crisis that profiteers and exploiters and the global different factions of capital have put us in.
Thank you, Zaki. That's a good point to end it, that we must all get involved. People who are involved include the KCB 11, and a reminder that those 11 young activists were released on the 22nd of July after spending 90 days in prison. A reminder that what we're dealing with here is not theoretical. So as Zaki says, that we need to get involved, and as Antoine mentions, that the pressure on the banks needs not relent. And mark your calendars once again, on the 26th of August is when the next hearing will be happening. Thank you, gentlemen. That's been episode 11.